My name's Pam Wade. I'm with the South Florida Water Management District. I manage a bureau that is called the Everglades and Estuaries Protection Bureau. Our bureau focuses primarily on water quality, watershed runoff, monitoring, research, and source controls for nutrient. Today we're here because the Florida legislature directed the South Florida Water Management District to do rulemaking. And the rulemaking that we're doing is in support or a component of the overall strategies to restore and protect the Northern Everglades. And these workshops are our way of, one way of us trying to gather input from the people that are in the affected areas. We're going to start with a presentation by Stephanie Olson here. It'll be about 30 minutes. And after the presentation, we'll take comments, questions, discussion. And then at the end, we'll hang around as long as we need to do one-on-one answers, questions, discussion for those of you more comfortable with that. Just so that you know, we are recording the meeting. Restrooms are out to that side. With that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie Olson. She's a district longtime scientist, an expert in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, an expert in 40E-61 rules, as well as the Northern Everglades. So with that.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning. We're really glad you're here today. The discussion is going to be on Chapter 40E-61 of the Florida Administrative Code, which is also known as the Works of the District Rules. The presentation is really only about 19 slides, so if you could please hold your comments and questions to the end, that would be appreciated. So just to remind everybody what these rules do, the existing rules prescribe how entities connect to the district's surface water management system for the purposes of protecting water resources. And today we're going to discuss a number of different things. First, we're going to talk about why these rules need to be updated and what the geographically affected areas are. We'll also go through water quality conditions and discuss the legislative directions for the rule and the history. We'll also discuss the activities of the agencies involved in restoration in this area. We're also going to discuss items that we need to consider as we're doing this rulemaking. We'll present a draft concept for the rules, and we'll wrap up with our timeline, workshop schedule, and how you can stay involved. So before we get into why we're doing this rulemaking, I have this map here on the left-hand side of this slide. Whoops, sorry. Well, let me go back. There we go. Okay, on the left-hand side of this slide that depicts the Lake Okeechobee watershed, the the St. Lucie River watershed here in orange, and the Caloosahatchee River watershed here in green. And you can see there's overlap between these three watersheds. And that's pretty much the Northern Everglades watersheds. And the reason we're doing this rulemaking is the Florida statutes require the district to revise the rules for the Lake Okeechobee watershed and to develop new rules for the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie River watersheds. And you may be wondering, well, why does the legislature say that? So the purpose of this slide helps to answer that question. The Department of Environmental Protection has determined that those three watersheds are impaired and has set something called total maximum daily loads, which are essentially restoration goals for each of the three watersheds. And the graphs on this slide, I have one for each watershed. On the left side are the restoration goals that have been set by DEP, and on the right-hand side are the current water quality conditions. So you can see that restoration is needed. Now I want to step back with this next slide and discuss a little bit about how the restoration efforts have evolved through time. It all began in 1987 with something called the Surface Water Improvement and Management Act. And there was a portion of that act, specifically it had a number, it was 373.4595, and that was specific to Lake Okeechobee. And that was really, the basis of that act was the basis for the existing 40E-61 rules. But that same piece of legislation today is now known as the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program. And this slide lists many of the various changes that have happened to that statute. It also has a few other things on it that I do want to point out. One is in 2005, there is another statute, which is 403.067. That is the statute that governs how DEP determines that water bodies are impaired and how they set their total maximum daily loads or restoration goals. And in 2005, that particular statute was amended to say that DEP could use something called Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, as their plans for restoration in these areas. But it said that they could use it. It didn't say that they had to. Then in 2007, that's when that other statute, 373.4595, that's when it became the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program, and the river watersheds were added. Between 2012 and 2014, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection developed basin management action plans for the 3 Northern Everglades watersheds. Then in 2016, we had a number of things happen. The NEP statute was revised, and requirements were put on DEP so that now it must develop basin management action plans for these 3 watersheds. The other thing that the 2016 NEP directed was that the Water Management District must revise the rules for 40E-61. And because there's been so many statutory changes, the underlying authorities for the 40E-61 rules have changed. Therefore, the old rules really are obsolete, and we must start from scratch. And also in 2016, the coordinating agency roles were redefined. Now, the coordinating agencies are the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the South Florida Water Management District. And my next slide talks a little bit about each of their activities. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection is a lead on water quality through their basin management action plans. The Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is the lead on agricultural BMPs. And the South Florida Water Management District is the lead on hydrologic improvements through their protection plans, which consists of a research and water quality monitoring program and the construction projects. And the 40E-61 rule is just one program under the protection plan. So now that you kind of know where 40E-61 fits into the big picture, let's talk a little bit about what the NEP statute, the 2016 NEP statute, directed the district to do. We kind of already talked about the first 2 bullets. We have to revise the rules for the lake, and we have to have new rules for the river watersheds. The statute also directed that these new rules be consistent with the NEP statute itself and with that other statute, 403.067, which, remember, that's the statute that covers basin management action plans. The district must also provide for monitoring for those that are not implementing best management practices through DACs or through DEP. It could be ag or non-ag. The other thing that the 2016 NEP required is that a research and water quality monitoring program be developed. So now this next slide, this shows the boundary changes that have occurred. On the left-hand side, we have the existing 40E-61 boundary, and then the map on the right shows that same boundary superimposed over the NEP boundaries. So to be consistent with NEP, we need to expand the boundaries, even in the Lake Okeechobee watershed. Now I want to take a moment here and step back and explain why we didn't come out today with draft rule text. We received a lot of comments at our October board meeting expressing the desire to see draft rule text. And this watershed is quite large and very complex. It's very diverse. There are urban areas, there are agricultural areas, and staff felt that if we drafted some text at this point, it might work for, say, 60% of the watershed, but it might be impractical for the other 40%. So we really wanted to come out with some concepts, see if we were on the right track before we started drafting. And we will come back out. We are going to do a second set of workshops where we will have rule text. So there will be an opportunity to comment on rule text in the future. So as we're considering how we're going to conduct this rulemaking, we need to look at what the statutes say in terms of what the district's authorities are. We're going to look to see if there's any gaps in the restoration efforts that are within the district's legislative authorities that the rules could assist with. We'll look at the current water quality condition. We want to avoid duplication with other regulatory programs. And we are going to present today, like I said, a draft concept for the rules, and we definitely want to consider stakeholder input to help ensure that the rules are practical. So with that, I'm going to jump into the draft concept, which consists of 3 components. The first component is a monitoring component, which actually has 2 parts. The first part is to develop those requirements for those entities that are not implementing BMPs, as I mentioned before, either through DACS or through DEP. The second part of that component is to consider using existing monitoring, whether it be the district's monitoring network, which is recently expanded, and plus maybe some additional monitoring. Some of the feedback we got at our last workshop was this map only includes the district's monitoring. So we do have a poster up here when we're done, if you want to come look to see where other monitoring occurs in the watershed that DEP has tracked through something called the Watershed Information Network, or WIN. DEP is looking at all the monitoring done in the Northern Everglades. It's still determining which sites they're going to use for the basin management action plans, although I think they're going to have that nailed down pretty soon. So we have monitoring. That monitoring could be used to represent nutrient levels in contributing areas, evaluate nutrient reduction technologies and projects. It could be used to have the coordinating agencies make informed decisions on the next steps. The rules could establish the methods to assess the data from the monitoring networks so that we can track our progress. And then the rules could define what triggers an action and define what those actions might be. So I'm going to go into more details on each of these concepts in just a bit. But I want to, before we do that, this next slide, I just want to mention a few other things that we want to consider as we receive your feedback. Ideas come in many forms, and what might work really well for certain stakeholders might cause a severe hardship for others. So it's important for us to consider the different situations, but we want to make sure we achieve our end goal, which is assisting with achieving the restoration efforts. Any ideas we have will also have to be compared against what the district's statutory authorities allow it to do. Again, we want to have reasonable rules that are implementable, and we also want to make sure that we do not have any unintended consequences from our rules. So now let's go a little bit deeper into the draft concept. The first part is for the monitoring component, and this slide presents monitoring in lieu of BMPs, basically those who are not implementing BMPs. What kind of requirements should we have for those entities? And whatever we draft with this section of the rules, we need to consider a couple things. First, it will have to be consistent with DEP's statewide requirements. DEP has a statewide rule that is similar. It has monitoring requirements for those not implementing BMPs, so we would have to be consistent. But it may be possible for us to be more specific for this particular area. Other things we want to consider is what is practical. We've also heard at a lot of board meetings that there are challenges to monitoring in these areas, so we want to make sure it's practical. And there, you may have other ideas that you'll present during our comment period. The second part of the monitoring component was looking at the existing water quality network. And again, the map on this slide is just showing the district's existing and proposed monitoring network. But there are other monitoring that we can also consider that's done through DEP's WIN. And this particular table shows the information for the district's monitoring in the Northern Everglades. And I wanted to point out a couple things. The red squares are what we consider our basin level monitoring. That is where we determine loads for each of the basin areas. Like I'll try to highlight here, this is the Fish Eating Creek Basin. And so the monitoring for that is over in this area. That would be where we would determine what the load is because we have measurements of flow and concentration at our basin monitoring site. Upstream of that, we have samples that are collected, just grab samples that have concentration information. And that helps us to zoom in to areas of concern within those areas. So that's what we use the upstream monitoring network for. And you'll notice with our expanded monitoring, we're also adding some additional parameters. So we'll have speciation of the phosphorus and nitrogen that will help us to inform what kinds of projects we need to include. So once we have the data, then we need to determine how we're going to assess that data. We need to look to see there may be existing long-term trends that we should review. We need to identify what kind of statistical tests we're going to look at. Will we be using averages? Will we use trends? Another thing to consider is maybe we will use a combination of factors. There are basins within these watersheds that have decreasing trends, but they have very high, what we call unit area loads, meaning if you factor the loading over the acreage of the basin, the pounds per acre is very high when you compare it to other areas. So even though they might have a nice decreasing trend, you might still want to do a project in that area because it has such high unit area loads. And you may have other ideas on this as well. So once we have the monitoring assessed and determined an action or determined that we need to take an action, we need to determine what type of action we will take. And I've just laid out a few ideas here. I'm sure there are many more. One, we would want to communicate our findings to our coordinating agency partners, DEP and DACS, and that may constitute a reevaluation of BMPs. Maybe some of the speciation data we've collected will tell them what types of projects they should put in. For example, if we're seeing a lot of particulate phosphorus in a particular area, maybe they will put in additional sediment controls or recommend that their constituents put in additional sediment controls. We also the monitoring may trigger additional monitoring. Maybe we'll determine, we see some high concentrations in this area or additional loads. Maybe there's additional flow monitoring we need to do to determine how high the loads are. Maybe it'll trigger us going to DEP's WIN network to see if there's any additional monitoring they have. Another potential action would be additional regional projects, such as stormwater treatment areas like the Lakeside Ranch STA. And another type of action might be implementing improved water management systems. There's a cost share program through Southwest Florida Water Management District for tailwater recovery. Maybe something like that could be implemented. And we do have brochures on that in the back if you're interested in what that looks like. And again, you may have other ideas. So this pretty much wraps up our ideas for the concept. We do look forward to hearing from you during our public comment period. I just want to mention a few final things. Our timeline. We are currently at this point where we're presenting our concepts to everyone. After we get the feedback and can complete all of our workshops, we're going to be drafting rule texts. And we hope to come back out with the rule text and conduct additional workshops sometime beginning in January. Again, you'll have time to comment on those then. And this is our upcoming workshop schedule. You can see this is the second one we've completed. Next week, we're going to be doing Kissimmee and Stewart and West Palm Beach. And I was asked earlier at the previous workshop, what is a good time to give comments by? And I just want to mention, if you do have comments, if you could give them by the end of this month, that would really be helpful because we're pretty much going to be drafting the rule text in December. And this slide goes into how you can stay involved. We're really glad you're here. Like I said, we're going to have a public comment in just a moment. We're also going to stay around after that to talk to people. So if you'd like to meet with us after the meeting, we'll be hanging around. And also, we have a website where you can get the latest information and you can leave comments there as well. And with that, we will open it up for questions and comments. I would like to ask everybody to remember to state your name and who you're with for the record before providing your comments. Thank you. All right, I got two right there. Oh, yes, and we're going to ask you to come to the front, please. I forgot.
Does this work? Test, test.
It works for the video, not for the...
Gotcha.
Okay.
Just speak louder now.
My question is, in terms of the monitoring in lieu of, is that monitoring as compared to numeric nutrient criteria or some sort of pre equals post kind of criteria? Because the situation we have is if you're not meeting either numeric nutrient criteria or TMDL loads, and that delta has to be treated by the stakeholders downstream or wherever that's in the designated B map to pick up that difference. So what is the monitoring compared to, I guess?
That's a really good question. If you look at DEP's rules, they kind of define what you have to do for the monitoring, but I don't think they were very specific in that particular area as to what the monitoring is compared to. So that may be something that we need to consider for these rules. At least that's my understanding of how they're looking at it. Did that answer your question? Okay.
James Evans, City of Sanibel. This doesn't sound like it's on, but the question I have is, it looks like the NEEP rules and the amended NEEP rule focus on phosphorus. Will there be any consideration in monitoring of nitrogen, since that's usually the limiting nutrient downstream that affects the estuaries?
Thank you for that question. That was a good question. The NEEP legislation does speak specific to phosphorus for the Lake Okeechobee watershed. However, for the river watersheds, it talks about, I believe, pollutants. So nitrogen can be considered for the river watersheds.
State your name and here.
Good morning, John Casani, Cliffs Waterkeeper. I had just a monitoring question. So for non-point source dischargers, once the discharge is downstream in the mixing zone, how can you attribute loading to a specific property or a non-point source discharger? That seems to be why most of the programs deal with assumptions about modeling, that use modeling to address those. But so you mentioned earlier there's some using BMPs and some not, and then this is for those who are not. So I'm trying to understand how you can attribute those not from discharge from those properties.
Okay, thank you for that question. That was also very good. We have to have in our rules specific requirements for those not implementing BMPs. But the part of the rules that deal with the monitoring within the watershed, that could be a measure overall of different nutrient levels from a basin. And once we have an assessment methodology that says, hey, this particular area, it looks like either the trends are increasing or we have high unit area loads or we've determined some trigger, that could then trigger actions, which means maybe we report that to DEP and DAX, who then have to deal with those implementing best management practices and determine, are those best management practices working, or whatever their action would trigger. We still have to work on what their action would trigger. That would be kind of up to them. But we would be reporting saying, hey, we have an area here that looks like it has an issue. So something needs to happen. It may be, as I said, it may be that the district decides we need to have a regional project there.
Talk about 3 tiers.
3 tiers. Okay.
But just as a quick follow-up, so you see that as enforceable under the rule? I mean,
Well,
so an adjacent property owner could say, no, it's, or the property owner in question may be saying, no, it's coming from somewhere else. How do you determine where it's coming from?
Well, remember, there was also an action that we might need to do additional monitoring. So maybe we could do additional monitoring to help pinpoint where it is coming from. But it would, the BMAP is the mechanism for enforcement. Can you come to the front? Thank you.
Morning. Sorry I came in late, but what standards will you be using for assessing thresholds or, a need for actions? And if you're, and I wanted to add, if we're just using the TMDLs, we already know the lake needs a nitrogen standard and the estuaries need phosphorus, or at least the Klushatchee doesn't have a phosphorus standard, and we do need that. Will that be possible? So 2 questions.
Well, at this point, we're still developing our assessment of what would trigger an action. So we don't necessarily have a standard yet. As to the nitrogen, yeah, it could be trends or ranking. The question on phosphorus, I mean, we're collecting phosphorus and nitrogen in all the Northern Everglades watersheds. So I'm not sure about our legislative authority for, having nitrogen in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, but maybe that, we'll have to look at the authorities for that. Right, okay.
I just wanted to add that, again, DEP is the authority from the BMAP umbrella on water quality. So right now, they're working on establishing benchmarks in addition to the TMDLs. And these benchmarks that they're establishing would be used to identify priority areas. So we're really relying on them for that part of it. So what we're trying to do is develop methods for monitoring that work at the 3 levels. We've got the load levels at the subwatershed levels, the basin levels that are well established. Then we've got this upstream monitoring, which are the yellow and green dots on the map. So anything that the rule might be used to clarify how that data will be used, the methods that will be used to analyze the data, that's one of the things that we're looking at a potential use for this rule. That data represents smaller but still collective areas, collective landowners, industries within area that's considered to be hydrologically represented at a smaller scale. And then you've got the individual monitoring that the statute is very specific, that we come up with individual monitoring for those people who are not implementing the DEP BMPs for non-ag or the DAX BMPs for ag. So that's like 3 tiers of monitoring. We're trying to define in this rule how monitoring could be used to trigger action or to be assessed, methods, statistical methods to assess that data. But it's DEP that really comes up with standards, water quality standards or benchmarks in addition to the TMDLs. So anything we would do would be in alignment with that. Did that help? I think so. Go, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
Just state your name and number.
Hi, my name is Lisa Can you hear me? Is it on?
So the mic is for the video.
Oh, okay. My name is Lisa Krueger. I work for Lee County Division of Natural Resources. And I know a lot of the conversation and history about the rule has been in regard to agriculture. But when I go to look at the monitoring network, I just wanted to wonder how much of this is going to be talking about urban situations, how much monitoring is going to be going on to try to assess what potentially is coming from non-point discharges from stormwater management systems in private developments. Is any of, and is that going to be possible? Is that part of the conversation? And if so, would any of this information be used to dovetail into any kind of ERP processes if you discover that stormwater management systems for developments are a contributor to any pollutant loading?
I'm not sure I understood. It sounded like you said the monitoring's been focused on ag. No? Okay. The monitoring's actually set up to represent hydrologic drainage areas from different scales. So then your question would be, what would be triggered? So there's lots of things that could be triggered. It could trigger ERP action, could trigger DAX, BMP, notice of intent action, could trigger DEP, NPDES action. Whatever tools are out there to help solve the problem could be triggered.
Gary Ritter with the Florida Farm Bureau Federation. I guess my question is, there's obviously a lot of different agencies, both at the county, local level, DEP, Water Management District. They're doing a lot of monitoring. Even, non-governmental groups are doing monitoring now that will obviously and it sounds like will be used to help make decisions in the watershed. I am curious, as a lot of the monitoring goes into the wind system, and I'm assuming that whatever monitoring data is being used, that it's going to follow the 62160 DEP criteria, developing quality assurance, quality control programs, standard operating procedures, whoever's doing that type of monitoring. So in other words, if the data is going to be used in any capacity, it has to have that type of standard monitoring criteria passed through DEP.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. As I said, we mentioned at the last meeting, we kind of focused on the district monitoring, and we received so many questions about the other areas. And so I think what we need to do is we need to go back and take a hard look at some of those areas where we know there's monitoring. You're right, we'll have to look to make sure that it's collected in a manner that would be compatible with how we're using the rest of the monitoring data and be able to use it that way. So again, it may be, that's why one of the actions could be if we are seeing monitoring in a different, in a certain area where we're seeing increasing trends, it may be that we have to go in there and maybe we decide, we see there is some monitoring there, but it's not quite, necessarily where we feel it needs to be. Maybe the frequency isn't as often as the rest of the area, so maybe we need to do some additional monitoring there. That's why it could trigger one of those actions.
And would there be situations to where if, you're looking at the data and maybe the two agencies need to do split sampling just to kind of verify what's going on out there?
Yeah, I'm sure that could be another action too. Oh, yeah, we actually have an audit program in the EAA where we go out and we do split sampling, and we look at how the entity that's collecting the sample, how they're collecting it to make sure it is collected in the proper manner. So we could have something like that as
All right.
well.
Thank you.
Yes, come forward, please.
Hi, my name is Wanda Clough, and I'm from Naples, and I'm representing my family, my friends, and Clean Water Now. And my question is, do you have a statement of goals and a timeline that you can read to us today? And also, in this statement, does it include the terms saving Florida's wildlife and protecting and providing clean water for all now and in the future? Thank you.
Well, the goal for the overall strategies is to restore and protect the Northern Everglades. The goal of this particular rule, I think, is in the early slide where the statute kind of gives us direction on what we need to accomplish. It's just one small component of that overall strategy.
Okay, I guess if we have no other comments, I guess we'll open it up for the open house.